The night the storm ended, I didn't tell anyone I was still drowning. Everyone had gone back to their lives. The emergency alerts had stopped screaming through radios. The skies had cleared just enough to let people pretend it never happened. And the world, in its usual way, moved on like nothing had broken. But inside me, something still shook. Something still leaked at the seams. Something still howled in the spaces where no one was looking. And I remember standing at the edge of what used to be a street but now looked like a wound. Water still ankle-deep and full of everything that used to mean stability mailboxes. Shoes, a child's plastic chair drifting quietly like it had. Given up to, and I remember thinking, this doesn't feel like survival. It feels like aftermath. And then I heard your voice calling my name like it was the only thing worth saving. Soft but urgent, like you were afraid I'd slipped under without anyone noticing. And I wanted to answer. I really did. But my throat felt like sandpaper, and the world felt like a test I had already failed. So I just stood there while you came. Closer, barefoot, soaked, eyes wide but calm like always. And when you reached me, you didn't ask what I was doing or why I hadn't come inside or what it meant that I was still standing where the flood had been the worst. You just held out your hand and said, "Come home," like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And something in me cracked then, not because I didn't want to follow you, but because I didn't know where home was anymore. And maybe you knew that. Maybe you saw it in the way I didn't move. So instead of walking away or getting frustrated or trying to drag me back, you stepped into the water beside me and stood there in silence, shoulder to shoulder, like we were waiting for something to rise or settle or speak. And I think that's the moment I started to believe, again, not in safety or in happy endings, but in you, in the simple, sacred fact that someone would step into the wreckage without needing a reason, without demanding I be okay first, without trying to rescue me from the ache. And after a while, when my fingers finally stopped trembling, and my knees stopped locking up, and I felt my breath catch in a way that didn't hurt, I looked at you, really looked. And you smiled like you knew I'd make it back eventually, like you didn't need me to rush it. And we walked home barefoot, dripping, quiet, the storm behind us but still echoing somewhere deep in the bones. And inside, you made tea without asking, wrapped me in a blanket that still smelled like your old laundry detergent, the one I used to tease you about, and we sat on the floor like furniture was too formal for grief. And you let me say nothing, which was exactly what I needed. And when I finally spoke, it wasn't a confession or a breakdown or anything poetic. It was just, I thought I'd be different after all this. And you nodded like you understood, like maybe you weren't different either. Like maybe survival doesn't always make us stronger. Sometimes it just makes us softer. And in the days that followed, you never told me how to heal. Never offered advice wrapped in pity. Never acted like I was a project that needed fixing. You just kept showing up, the soft way you closed the door behind you so I wouldn't startle. In the way you refilled my water without saying a word. In the way you played music that didn't ask anything of me, just filled the air with something warm and alive. And the more you stayed, the more I began to trust the staying. And that was new, terrifying, almost too good to name out loud. Because I had learned that most people leave when the storm ends, when the urgency fades and the scars stop bleeding. When you're no longer a story they can tell themselves they're helping to save, but you didn't. And there were nights when I woke up gasping from dreams I couldn't remember and found you asleep in the chair beside me, head tilted back, a blanket half pulled across your lap like you'd planned to stay only a minute and forgot how to leave. And those nights are etched into me more deeply than anything the storm took. Because it wasn't what you said or did that saved me, it was the quiet way you waited. The way you let me return to myself without asking for a map. And if I never find the words to explain what that meant, I hope this is enough. I hope the way I still reach for your hand without thinking. The way I breathe easier when I hear your footsteps in the hall. The way I've started leaving the windows open again, I hope. All of that tells you what I haven't said yet. That you didn't just survive the storm with me. You stayed when the sky cleared and the world forgot and everything hurt in thee. Way only silence does, and somehow, that's what brought me back. The strange thing about surviving is how quiet it gets after the noise stops. How the silence becomes heavier than the screaming ever was. How your body forgets how to relax even when the danger is gone. And I remember waking up every morning, not with peace, but with panic. Like my brain didn't trust the calm. Like I had trained myself so well to expect collapse that stillness became the new threat. And you noticed before I said anything, you always did. You'd walk in with coffee you didn't even drink yourself and set it on the table without a word. Like placing an offering at the altar of whatever part of me hadn't shattered yet, and some days I wouldn't touch it. Some days I couldn't even lift my eyes to meet yours, but you kept doing it anyway, and maybe that was the first ritual. The first crack of light, the first thread in the tapestry neither of us knew we were weaving yet. And those early days were thick with fog, literal and emotional whole hours blurring into each other. Me floating through the apartment like a ghost who hadn't realized it was allowed to be alive again. And you never rushed me, never forced. Conversation, you just existed near me like an anchor, and that was enough, more than enough. And I remember the first time you laughed again. Really laughed at something stupid I said without thinking, and we both froze, like breaking the silence. Had woken something up, and then you smiled and said, "There you are." And I didn't know whether to cry or apologize or say thank you. So I just laughed too, and it felt like an exhale I'd been holding since the water first rose. And after that, the air shifted a little, like maybe we were both remembering how to be human again, and we started making dinner together even though I barely ate. Started watching old movies even though I couldn't focus. Started sitting on the porch wrapped in the same blanket just to feel the night air and remind ourselves that the world was still here. Still spinning, still offering us something, even if we didn't know what to do with it yet, and I don't. Think I'll ever forget the night we sat out there in silence and you suddenly said, "Do you think it's okay to start hoping again?" And I wanted to say yes, but all I could manage was, maybe. And somehow that was enough, because you nodded like I'd just handed you something sacred. And the next morning, you taped a little note to the fridge that just said, "Hope is allowed." Here, and I read it so many times that the ink started to fade, and I never told you. But that note pulled me back on the days I couldn't find a reason to move, couldn't remember why staying mattered, and it was in the little things that I began to believe how you always turned on the hallway light before bed so I wouldn't have to walk through the dark. How you played the same quiet music in the mornings like a soundtrack to surviving. How you started saying we instead of you. Like healing wasn't just mine to do alone, and I clung to that more than you knew because there were still days I felt like I was taking up too much space, like my grief was an inconvenience. Like my presence was a burden dressed as a body. But you never treated me like a project, never handed me timelines or inspirational quotes or survival statistics. You just stayed. And I began to understand that staying is an art, a choice made quietly over and over. And there is something holy about someone who chooses you on the days you cannot offer anything in return. And you chose me with every gesture, every wordless kindness. Every moment you didn't walk away when I gave you every excuse to. And slowly, my days stopped, feeling like emergencies. And I started noticing things again, the way the sunlight hit the window at 4 p.m. The sound of the kettle boiling. The way your eyes crinkled when you tried not to laugh too hard, and I started writing again. Little things, half-formed thoughts. On napkins and receipts, not because I had something to say, but because it reminded me I still existed. Still had a voice worth putting to paper, and one night, when I couldn't sleep, You walked into the living room and found me curled up with a notebook, and you didn't say anything. Just sat beside me and rested your head on my shoulder like. Maybe silence was a language we both knew fluently, and I remember thinking then, for the first time, maybe I'll make it. Not in a dramatic, cinematic kind of way, but in the quiet, practical way that feels like breath returning to your lungs after you forgot how to breathe. And when I looked over at you, eyes half closed and peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in weeks, I realized that even though the storm was over, even though the waters had receded and the power had come back and the world was pretending to be normal again, the truest part of my survival wasn't in the moment I didn't drown it, was in the moment I let someone see me soaked and shivering and afraid, and didn't look away. It was easier somehow when everything was falling apart, when survival was loud and urgent and no one expected me to smile or function or explain. But once the chaos faded and the routines crept back in the mail arriving again, the clocks ticking, the groceries being put away like nothing had happened, I started to panic in new ways. Softer ways, the kind that sit in your throat instead of your chest. The kind that whisper, "Are you still worthy of love if you're not broken enough to be pitied anymore?" And I didn't know how to tell you that. Didn't know how to explain that healing felt lonelier than hurting sometimes. Because at least when I was unraveling, people knew how to show up. But now that I was just existing, no longer in crisis, but not quite okay either, I felt like a half-finished sentence no one had the patience to wait for. And one night, while you were washing dishes and humming some old tune that didn't belong to either of us, I sat on the couch trying to disappear into the fabric, wondering if you'd notice if I slipped out the front door and kept walking until I forgot who I used to be. And then you turned around, slowly, like you'd heard the silence I was choking on, and said, "Do you ever feel like being alive is the loudest thing in the room?" And I didn't answer right away because the question cracked something in me. Not in a painful way, but in the way truth always does when it's been hiding too long. And I nodded, finally, and you dried your hands and came over and sat beside me without saying another word, just leaned your head against mine and let the question hang between us like something sacred. And I thought about how rare that was to be understood without having to translate yourself, to be felt in the spaces where language fails. I remembered all the times I'd been told I was intense or too quiet or too hard to read, and how none of those words had ever made me feel seen the way you just did by asking the right question at the right moment with no expectation of an answer. And maybe that's what love really is, or whatever this thing between us was becoming, not the fixing or the saving or the bright declarations, but the willingness to sit next to someone in their most invisible moment and say, "I see you." And so I started talking then, not because I knew what to say, but because you made it safe to speak without performing. And I told you how scared I was, that I'd never be the version of myself I used to imagine I'd grow into. How I felt like I was constantly disappointing the idea of me people had fallen in love with before they knew how quiet I could be. How hollow, how much space sadness could take up without even trying. And you didn't interrupt or correct or offer those well-meaning affirmations that always felt more like erasure than comfort. You just listened, and when I finally stopped and looked at you, your eyes were glossy but steady, and you said, "I don't need you to be anyone else to love being near you." And something about that sentence landed in my ribcage like a seed. Something that would take time to grow roots, but was already changing the shape of me from the inside. And after that, things didn't get easier in the way movies promise they do after a breakthrough, but they got softer. And I started noticing that I was reaching for you more often, not because I needed to be held up, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be held without having to fall first. And that kind of wanting felt new, like a language I was learning in fragments. And you were patient, always patient. Even on the days when I withdrew so far into myself, I forgot how to open the door again. and you'd just knock gently with a bowl of soup or a dumb joke or a shared silence. And little by little, I started to believe that maybe you weren't staying because you felt responsible for me. Maybe you were staying because you liked the version of me who was slow and sad and real and still trying. And maybe that meant I could like that version, too. And the more I let that possibility live in me, the more the fear loosened its grip. Not all at once, but in small ways. Like the way I stopped rehearsing conversations before I spoke to you. Or the way I started laughing before checking if you were already smiling. And sometimes I'd catch you looking at me like I was something fragile and beautiful. Not in a pedestal way, but in a you made it through, and I'm proud of you kind of way, and I think that mattered more than any compliment or apology or promise. Because you didn't love me for how well I carried the storm. You loved me for how I looked when I finally set it down. I didn't expect the joy to scare me more than the grief, but it did. And the first time I caught myself smiling without effort, laughing at something completely ordinary, I froze like someone had just shouted run, like happiness was a trap I had accidentally stepped into. And you must have noticed because you didn't laugh with me, not right away. You just looked at me the way you always did when I was about to disappear again steady. Soft waiting, and I think you knew that joy, for people like me, doesn't come as a reward. It arrives like a stranger at the door, and instead of welcoming it, I brace for the moment it leaves, and that night I stayed quiet a little too long and you didn't push. Just slid a playlist across the table with a smile and said, no lyrics, just feelings. And walked away like you hadn't just given me a lifeline disguised as lo-fi beats and ambient piano. And I played it on loop for days, trying to let myself feel without dissecting every emotion like it had to be earned, trying to believe that peace didn't have to be preceded by pain to be valid. And one afternoon, while I was watering the plant you insisted wasn't dead, I looked up and saw you dancing barefoot in the kitchen to a song I didn't recognize. And you looked at me like the moment was an invitation and not a demand. And for once, I didn't hesitate. Just walked in and let you spin me around once, twice, badly, awkwardly, beautifully, and we both laughed on cautiously, not nervously, but fully. And when the song ended, I realized I hadn't checked the door or the window or my own pulse in over 10 minutes. And that felt like a miracle. The quiet kind no one claps for. No. The kind you only notice when it's gone, and I didn't tell you right away. But that moment stayed with me longer than the sadness ever did, because it was proof that I could feel safe while being seen. Not just afterward, not just in hindsight, and in the days that followed. I caught myself noticing things I had trained myself to ignore, the way the light filtered through the curtains like a memory. The way your laughter always started in your throat and ended in your chest. The way I no longer needed to prepare an exit every time you got too close, and it terrified me how much I had come to depend on this stillness, this routine. This quiet sort of love that didn't ask me to become anything more than exactly what I was. And I think that's when the fear returned, not the fear of breaking, but the fear of losing something I had finally let myself want. And I started pulling away in small ways, closing doors I used to leave open, answering fine when I meant frightened, staying up too late so I wouldn't have to dream about what I couldn't say aloud. And one night you noticed, of course. You did, and you sat beside me on the floor like we always did when the weight got too heavy. And you whispered, you don't have to run just because something feels good. And I broke then, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a candle giving out after burning too long. And you pulled me into you like I was something familiar, not fragile. Like you'd been preparing your arms for this moment the whole time. And I think that's what made me cry, not the pain, but the softness I had been so afraid to believe in, the safety I had always seen as temporary. And when I whispered, what if I ruin this? You said, then we'll clean it up together, and I believed you. Maybe not completely, but enough to stay. Enough to lean into you and let myself be held without apology. And the next morning, you didn't act like anything had happened. You just made breakfast and asked what song I wanted to start the day with, and we danced again, terribly, joyfully. And I realized then that healing isn't a straight line or a finish line. It's a series of small, brave choices to stay when leaving would be easier, to hope when fear feels safer, to let someone love the parts of you you've been told are too much or too late or too broken. And that day, as we sat with mismatched mugs and toast, we kept burning. I looked at you like maybe I'd never really seen you before, and as a friend or a savior or a safe place, but as someone who had chosen me in the absence of performance, who had stayed after the storm. Yes, but more importantly, who had stayed during the silence, and I reached across the table, took your hand without explanation, and you didn't ask why. Just held it like you'd been waiting for the moment I finally realized you were never planning to let go. The hardest part of being seen is the part no one talks about, the part where you start to believe you're worthy of love, and then immediately wonder if they'd still stay if they saw everything. And I think I knew from the beginning that you weren't afraid of my darkness, but I still kept parts of it folded up inside me like smuggled grief. Like maybe if I could just carry it a little longer, I'd spare you the weight. And I was doing okay with that. I really was. Until the night it all spilled out without warning. One of those slow burn evenings where the air feels heavier than the sky, and something invisible presses behind your ribs like it's looking for an exit. And I remember sitting on the edge of the tub fully clothed while the shower ran because I couldn't make it to the water but needed the sound to feel like something was moving. And you knocked once, twice, and I didn't answer. But you came in anyway, gently, barefoot, and quiet, like the floor might bruise if you stepped too hard. And when you saw me there, knees pulled to my chest, arms wrapped around my own silence, you didn't panic or flinch or try to diagnose me with kindness. You just sank to the floor beside me and said, "I'm not leaving." And that's when I broke, not loudly, not violently, but in a way that felt like softness giving way under too much pressure. Like a whisper collapsing into tears. And I told you everything, not because I had the strength, but because your presence made honesty feel less dangerous. And I didn't look at you while I spoke, couldn't bear to. But I heard the way your breath stayed steady, the way you let the silence fill the cracks between my sentences without trying to cement them over. And I told you about the things I thought would make you walk away, the parts of me still soaked in shame and memory, the nights I'd disappeared into my own head because the outside world felt too sharp. And you didn't interrupt, didn't hand me a silver lining. You just nodded every so often, like you were keeping time with my heart, like you were listening with more than ears. And when I finally said, "I don't know how to be loved without apologizing for it," you reached for my hand slowly, like I might pull away. Nay, said, "Then don't apologize. Just let it happen." And those words settled into me like roots, like something I didn't know I needed had finally found its way home. And we stayed there for hours, in the bathroom with the steam curling along the tile and our hands clasped like a promise we didn't know we were making. And I realized then that the real miracle wasn't you staying after the storm. It was you staying inside the storm I hadn't even admitted I was still carrying. And in the days that followed, I noticed the small ways you started loving me, loud or not. In grand gestures, but in subtleties, like the way you started keeping extra towels in the bathroom, or how you switched out your playlist for the soft songs I used to hum under my breath. And one afternoon, when I found the post-it you'd left on the mirror that read, "You are not your worst memory," I didn't cry like I expected to. I just smiled, quietly. Like something had finally settled inside me, like I was finally starting to believe that healing didn't mean becoming unrecognizable. It meant becoming honest. And there was something so freeing about that, about being loved, not despite the chaos, but through it. Because of it, about being known without being edited. And that love didn't come with conditions or timelines. It's just presence, just patience. Just you reminding me every day with your actions what my words had never trusted before, that I could fall apart in front of you and still be someone you looked at like I was worth staying for. And I think that's when I stopped hiding, not all at once, but piece by piece. Letting you see the soft places I used to guard with silence. Letting myself laugh louder, cry messier, breathe deeper, and it wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was slow and real and brave in the quietest way. And now, when I think about love, I don't think about grand declarations or sweeping music. I think about a person on a bathroom floor holding my hand like it was something precious, not fragile. Like it was something you chose over and over, even after the storm had passed. There's a moment in every recovery where everything outside looks fine, but something inside still stumbles. And no one really warns you about that part. The way your laughter returns before your sleep does. The way your smile starts to show up in pictures, even though you still flinch when the wind sounds like sirens or when someone says your name too gently. And I had learned to perform wellness so convincingly that even I almost believed it. Walking through grocery aisles and answering texts and folding laundry, while grief curled up quietly in the corners like a cat no one had fed in days. And you never called me out for it, never forced me to unpack what I wasn't ready to look at. You just kept showing up with small, sacred kindnesses, restocking my favorite cereal without asking, cleaning up the dishes I'd pretend I didn't. See, learning which parts of the day made me quiet and which ones made me hum under my breath, like I used to when I was little and afraid of the dark. And sometimes I'd find myself watching you when you weren't looking, wondering if you ever felt tired from carrying someone else's storm long after the clouds had moved on. But you always moved like someone who wasn't afraid of staying, like someone who understood that love wasn't about fixing what's broken. It was about learning to live with the pieces. And I remember the afternoon the power went out again, just for a moment. Just long enough for my breath to catch and my heart to race and my body to forget that the danger wasn't real this time. And you didn't panic or ask questions, you just walked into the room with a candle already lit and said, just in case. Like you had expected the fear and made space for it before it even arrived. And that's when I realized something I hadn't been brave enough to name. This wasn't just care. This was devotion, not the loud kind that shouts over rooftops, but the quiet kind that whispers across days, across casseroles and charger cables and porch lights left on longer than necessary. And I started trusting the silence again, not because it disappeared, but because you kept sitting in it with me, unbothered, like it was just another kind of music. And we developed these little rituals that meant more than anything either of us ever said. Your half nod when I finished a meal. The way you never commented when I left the door open between our rooms. The shared blanket during movie nights, even though we had to. And I didn't tell you right away, but I started sleeping better when you were home, not because you did anything, but because your presence settled something in me that no therapy session had ever reached. And that kind of safety doesn't come often, doesn't come easy. And sometimes I'd lay awake wondering how I got so lucky, wondering if I deserved it. And then I'd hear your soft breathing from the other room, and the questions would stop. Not because they were answered, but because they didn't matter as much as they used to. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger, something quieter. And one evening, we were sitting on the porch watching a thunderstorm from a distance. And you said you don't brace anymore when it rains. And I hadn't even realized. Hadn't even noticed that my hands were open and my shoulders were loose and my breath was steady. And I looked at you, really looked, and said, I think I trust it now. And you smiled like that was all you'd ever wanted. Not a thank you or a confession or some dramatic realization. Just this me, in one piece, watching the storm from the safety of a home we had both built with nothing but time, patience, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be spoken to be known. And I still have bad days, still wake up sometimes feeling like my chest is full of water. Still get quiet without warning, but now, when that happens, I don't spiral. I just find you or let you find me. And we sit in it together, and that's more powerful than any rescue because you never tried to drag me out of the dark. You just held my hand until my eyes adjusted to the light again. The day I told you I was ready to leave wasn't loud or ceremonial. It was quiet in the way most real beginnings are, and I remember sitting across from you at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea I hadn't touched, and you just looked at me with that expression you always wore when you already knew what I was going to say before I said it. And I didn't even need to explain because you nodded slowly like someone pressing their palm to a piano key, just to feel the weight of the sound. And for a moment I felt the panic rise, this ache that leaving might undo everything we'd built. But then I looked at you, and you weren't afraid. You were proud. And that's when I understood what kind of love this really was. The kind that doesn't bind you to a place, but frees you to become something beyond it. And you helped me pack without asking questions, folding shirts with more care than I ever had. Setting aside little things I might forget but would need later, like the charger I always left behind, or the scarf I once claimed I hated but wore on every difficult day. And you labeled each box in your handwriting because you knew I'd get overwhelmed halfway through and lose track of what mattered. And we didn't say much while we packed, just worked side by side in that comfortable silence we'd come to live inside. And when everything was ready and the bags were zipped and the keys were in my palm, I stood in the doorway and looked around at the life we'd created in this quiet corner of the world where healing had been allowed to grow like ivy, slow and strong and unnoticed until suddenly it was everywhere. And I wanted to thank you, to find some way to say that you hadn't just helped me survive. You had made survival feel sacred, but all I could manage was, "Are you sure you'll be okay without me?" And you stepped forward and pulled me into a hug so full it made my knees weaken, and whispered, "I was never here to hold you forever, just until you remembered how to stand." And something about that broke me, but not in the way I used to break. It wasn't the kind of shattering that left pieces. It was the kind that made space, like a window being opened after too many months sealed shut. And I cried then, not because I was scared, but because I was safe enough to feel it all, to let it move through me without shame or silence. And when I pulled back, your eyes were wet too, but your smile didn't falter, and you handed me a small notebook with a note tucked inside, and said, "For the days when you forget how far you've come," and I kept it in my bag like a talisman, like a piece of this version of me I'd found in your presence. And when I finally walked down the steps and stepped into the world outside, I expected the fear to come crashing back, but it didn't. It was there, sure, humming at the edges, but it wasn't in charge anymore. And I think that's what growth really is, not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it close the door again. And as I looked back one last time, you were still standing there, barefoot on the porch, hoodie sleeves pushed up, arms crossed, looking exactly like the moment everything began to change. And I smiled, really smiled, and waved. And you didn't wave back. You just nodded, like a secret being kept, like a story being passed on. And I knew then that this friendship wasn't ending. It was evolving, becoming something quieter but no less real. Something I would carry with me, not like a memory, but like a heartbeat. Steady and unseen, and even now, in a new city with new lights and new days unfolding like pages, I still hear your voice when things go quiet, still catch myself setting out 2 mugs instead of 1, still look for signs that someone understands the way you did, and maybe I never will find that again. Not in the same shape, not in the same softness. But that's okay, because once someone teaches you how to stay with yourself the way they stayed with you, you never really feel alone again. And maybe that's the greatest kind of goodbye, the one that leaves you more whole than it found you. The kind that doesn't close a chapter but opens a new one with trembling hands and an open heart. The kind that proves some friendships aren't measured by distance or time or proximity, but by presence, by witness, by love that knew when to hold on and when to let you go gently into the life you are finally ready to live.